We are live.
We are live. All right, everybody. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Sense and Signal podcast with Jodah and Dan. And today we are delighted to be here with Alexandra Mannerings, a human-centered data geek with a PhD in veterinary science and who runs a company that you can hire called, and I hope I'm going to get this right because she's coached me on this several times already, Moroccanos. God, I'm so white. So it's Greek, right? Moroccanos is Greek. Can you give us a little bit about the etymology of what Moroccanos means?
When we say it's Greek, it's a word I made up, but used some Greek words to make it up. And so it comes from Meraki, which means to do something with all your heart and soul. And then nous, which is where we get like cognate and knowledge that root from. So like more deductive logic. So I joke that I made up a Greek word that means like heartfelt logic or like soulful data.
Nice.
Cool. I like it.
And so you provide data analytic education and support for nonprofits and businesses, which is one of the reasons we wanted to have you on the show today, is to talk about data and leadership and sense making. That's the kind of heart of our show. And heart, getting back to that heart aspect that you mentioned. But to start us off, I got a couple jokes for you about data that I had an AI bot help me write, because nothing is more comedic than AI and data. So you want to hear some of the jokes?
Of course I do.
Okay. So what do you call a complex system that has no patterns? What do you call a complex system that has no patterns? 3, 2, 1. A paradox. Right. I hear the roaring laughter throughout YouTube land and podcast land. Okay.
Fantastic.
How do you make a complex system more complex? How do you make a complex system more complex?
Have Congress write a law about it.
Well, the punchline from AI is you add more simplicity. And I had to ask you, I was like, you explain the joke, and you failed at a joke, and you have to explain it, right?
You have to explain it.
And so AI was like, well, go on, you explain it.
Oh, no, I was going to say, I'm pretty sure Mark Twain had a quote of saying, I wrote you a long letter today because I didn't have time to write you a short one. Right,
Yes.
like that it's hard to do things simply. That's all I was thinking about.
Yeah, and when the AI bot was like, well, sometimes if you add it's counterintuitive. If you add some simplicity to a already complex system, it can actually generate much more complexity. I guess AI knows more about complexity theory than I do. Here's the last one I will torture you with. How many complexity scientists does it take to change a light bulb?
Depends on your starting parameters, right? Isn't that chaotic system rules?
It could be. According to AI, and this is the punchline from AI, none. They just observe the emergent behavior of the light bulb and try to model it.
No, the question is, are you keeping all of those bad puns in your data bank, right?
Oh.
Yes.
No, I'm purging them right now.
Damn it, Dan. We got to use them again later on. So, Alexandra, so thanks for joining us today. As Dan said, we on this show, we like to talk about making sense, which sometimes we're probably more senseless. And we like to talk about signals, which I can say sometimes we introduce noise. And we are trying to make sure that doesn't happen as we move forward. And so we have you on to talk about data. And I think we all three of us can admit you use the word data and people's eyes will go like this.
Gloss over.
Or they will say, or the opposite, they think they know what it is and what the value of data is, right?
Because I'm a data-driven leader.
Right, exactly. I use data, right? Exactly. So let's kick the show off with just maybe you telling us what is data and what does it mean to modern day organizations and leadership? Just
It
whatever
is
comes to your brain.
the $1 million question, right? So
And
for
we'll dig deeper too. Trust me, Dan's got
of
1,000
course.
questions he's written down here that I'm gonna have to
I
read off.
have.
But we will. But yeah, let's just give us a thought. Give us your big thoughts here.
So for me, I view data as anything that can be stored permanently and recalled by anyone else, right? So the reason data have to be able to be stored and brought back again is how we make any use out of data. And it has to be able to be accessed by somebody other than you, meaning it can't just be in your brain, right? That doesn't count as data because it's not usable by anybody else. But when we think about data with that broad of a definition, it can be words, it can be pictures, it can be audio, it can be numbers, right? There's all sorts of things that do actually count as data that we often don't think about when we start to bring in this idea of data informing what we do. And what I say data does for us as organizations is it's like your instrument panel on your airplane, right? It's not going to tell you where to go. You don't get on board and the pilot says, let's find out where we're going. Oh, look at my instrument panel, right? They already know where they're going. They've made flight plans, but they're going to use that instrument panel to help make sure that they're staying on track with where they want to go. And they're going to use that instrument panel to help them if things go a bit awry and they have to adjust. They're going to take all that input in to be able to make a more refined and appropriate adjustment to those corrections. But also, it's not the end all be all. I think about Captain Sully and his ability to land an airplane in the Hudson. And he did that not necessarily because, he just had the right data and he just followed what the numbers told him. Yes, he needed the right data. He needed to have immediate feedback about what was happening to his engines. He needed immediate feedback about, the speed that his plane was going, his height above the ground. All of that had to be accurate and immediately available to him, well-processed data that had already been analyzed and given to him in the way that he needed it. But he also needed his thousands of hours of training as a military pilot to put that to use and successfully execute a very creative solution that ended up working out, for everybody. So that's how I think about data for organizations.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to the whole different differentiation between what is data and what is knowledge, right?
Yes.
Because data is just the data. It's the information that's out there, the numbers, the words, the images, whatever it might be. But you also have to take that data in and apply it to what you already know and whatever schemas you're already operating with to produce knowledge. Would that be a correct assessment or of what you're talking about?
Yeah, and we talk about oftentimes that knowledge is where you start to integrate many different pieces of data, and many different pieces of experience, many different observations and actual past experiences of your life into something that then can be put into action, right? Data by itself is never inherently actionable. It will give you hints and ideas and direction, point which direction something might be moving, but you need to be able to interpret that, contextualize it, and come up with ideas of options that could utilize that information. And that's where you then sort of move from those data points to the knowledge.
I tend to utilize the word signal a lot when I'm talking about data. I just say this is a signal. These are signals because I want to make sure that who I'm talking to that I've had issues, and I think you probably can relate to this where I give one data point and that data point was truth now, and it's like I had to constantly say this is a signal, just one signal, and so I've come to just to use that terminology that data is signals. I don't have.
Is there a difference between data and a signal?
Maybe there is. I'm just saying that's just
So I do think that it's going to be a bit of a pedantic difference, but I think there is some value to the difference, which is data are just stored pieces of information, right? So I can store all sorts of pieces of information. And for example, I may have a pedestrian sensor on a bridge. And what the data are that I'm storing is a trigger or a click every time, supposedly, someone walks by it, right? A laser beam gets broken and it goes tink, one pedestrian. But what I'm storing are data points of the number of times that sensor was triggered. Now, I'd like to think that means the number of people who walked by. But really what the data are the number of times that the sensor was triggered. And if there's
it's probably me just going back and forth trying to drive you crazy, like ding, ding,
right?
ding, 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 ding.
Exactly. And so the data could mean many different things. It could actually truly represent the number of people who cross the bridge. It could represent Dan messing with everybody. It could represent like a faulty signal, a faulty sensor, right? Where the sensor was just triggering itself and there was nothing there. It could have been confused by rain or hail, right? And that's where I think the separation between the data and the signal comes, which is the signal for me tends to be when you find something meaningful in the data. When you found something in the data that is useful, it's directionally correct. It enables you to make a better decision than you would have been able to make without it, right? And again, the signal doesn't have to be 100% accurate. It just has to be useful. Like, are you better off having it than you were without it? So that's where I would separate signal and data.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think that's good. And I want to get back to what Jodah was asking, because I think another important differentiation between what he was describing as a signal and what you said is a sample of one, right? And can a sample of one, like one instance of that piece of data, be meaningful enough to produce a signal?
So yes, because it depends what you're trying to do. If we go back to Captain Sully's example, he had one engine reading, but that was all he needed to know that something was very wrong with his engine, right? So in some instances, a single data point can be a very important signal, right? If my car's engine temperature, is in hot, I only need one of those readings to know that I really should check that out. But if you're trying to do something where you're, to what Jodah said earlier, making inferences about a larger population or inferences beyond that single point, or if you want to make inferences over time and talk about a trend in change, then yes, that point's when you need more than just a single data point to say that I have a signal.
Right.
All right, thanks, Dan, for making me wrong. So, anyways, next question. No, and it's interesting. So, I work in qualitative data mostly, not quantitative. So, I work in much smaller numbers in quant. Perhaps that those two sides might be separated by philosophical differences at times. But one, and I did notice that, I would one of the things I would do to get various leadership to sort of get on board with the analysis that we were doing is I'd show them the recordings, because I do, with the participants. And again, it was interesting how they glommed onto things differently than we glommed on from the same data sets, interpretation of data. What are your thoughts around that? Because it really does feel like, depending on who you are, you could get different things from even a single click of a button. Like you said, I could perceive, I know Dan. That's Dan. That's Dan messing with you because I know him well, But you're like, I don't think that's Dan. So anyways, yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
So a lot of thoughts. I'll start with the idea that we have to remember that data are always maps of reality, right? They will never be true reality, because the moment that you have true reality, then it's just reality. You haven't compressed it into any data that you've collected, right? And so, as they say about models, right, all maps are wrong, but some maps are useful. And so in that process of compressing from reality into a map that's going to help you navigate, you inevitably are discarding certain things and making value judgments about which parts are going to be helpful to you. And we as humans, the way that we navigate through the world or navigate through decisions, are going to find different pieces useful to us. And so I think that is always going to happen, right? That we're going to pick different pieces that are going to help us in how we're going to make a decision, or in the parts that we feel we need extra information to help us navigate. The second piece, though, that I would say is that there are places where interpretation and lived experience and context are critical for interpreting things, right? That you have to know what's going on in order to understand what the data are telling you. I was just talking to somebody who gave me a great example where they were combing through all of this app data from a financial transactions app that helps convert real currency into digital currency and back. And they were deploying it in a country in sub-Saharan Africa. And so they had all of this data about how the app was being used. And so it wasn't until they went to observe how the app, like these transactions were happening, that they realized that even though the app showed, all these just digital transactions from real currency back, what was happening in real life was that the people who were using the app would take their money and they would go find an agent of the app, people who are trained in using this, and they basically hand them their phone and say, you do the transaction for me. Here's my money. Here's my PIN. Like, you do it. That wasn't available in any of the data on the app, right? You couldn't know that from the data in the app. You had to see it happen, watch what was happening, and then apply that now. So then they knew they needed to do a very deep network analysis for how the actual like clients of the app were interacting with these trusted members who were helping them do these interactions. And so the way they interpreted the network analysis was suddenly very, very different, even though the raw data were the same. So that's where, again, when you talk about like people glomming onto different bits, like someone who has some lived experience that's going to be like, you're interpreting that wrong. Here's the reality that's actually happening on the ground. Like that's critical knowledge that, again, would lead you astray if you didn't have it. But then the last thing that I'll say about our different ways of interpreting it is sometimes there are wrong ways to interpret data, like just wrong. And I always think about one gentleman that I very, very briefly worked for, who had a, like we were writing up summaries from BRFIS data. So the behavioral risk factor surveillance system data from the CDC. So they interview, thousands of people and then make these estimates for how many people smoke and how many people do these different things that have risky behaviors for health. But they always give you a confidence interval around those estimates. So when they say 13.2% of people in Chicago smoke, it's an estimate, right? That they're interpreting out from this survey they've done. So they're not saying that exactly 13.2% of people in Chicago smoke. They're saying we're guessing it plus or minus 1.5% percentage points. And this gentleman that I was writing this story for was saying, oh, well, Chicago has a higher smoking rate than New York. And I looked at the numbers and I said, okay, well, Chicago's 13.2, New York is 12.5, but the confidence intervals overlap. Right? And he's like, but Chicago's clearly higher. And I was like, you can't say that for sure.
Right.
Because they're estimating. And he's like, oh, Alexandra, but 13 is bigger than 12. Right?
Yeah, it's a better story. It's a better story. Because we don't that gets into complexity and people don't handle complexity that well. And, you talk a lot about data literacy. And I think this speaks to data literacy. And I think, I remember taking statistics classes and I realized while I was taking them that, I don't have to be a master statistician. That's not the reason I'm taking this as part of my doctorate program. I'm taking this so I'm better attuned at reading the data, because it is like a reading skill. You're not reading text, you're reading data, whether it is qualitative or quantitative. And I agree, you kind of have to marry the both of them together to create true meaning out of it. But yeah, what is data literacy to you and why is it important in our culture for people to start developing that capacity to really be able to read the data?
I think we are so surrounded by data, by choices that are influenced by data, by algorithms that are run by data, that at this point, there's no such thing as data people and non-data people. We're all either comfortable, intentional data people or accidental, uncomfortable data people. Right? We don't have a choice about that. The same way that if you ask somebody like, do you need to be literate? Nobody's going to say, no, it's fine. I don't need to read. Like we all need to read. We need to be able to read words in order to navigate this world. And so data literacy is that ability to be conversant at some level with data or the products of data. And I always, again, when people are like, well, I'm not a numbers person. It's like, again, no one says they're not a words person. People might say, hey, I had dyslexia and it took me twice as long to learn to read, but I still learned to read because we all have to. And so the same way, like some things might come a little bit faster to somebody else, but we all have this certain base level of comfort with the products of data that we need. Now, we don't all have to write academic papers. We don't all have to be able to write medical textbooks. We don't all have to speak 17 languages, right? Like I'm not going to read Dostoevsky in its native Russian, right? Not happening.
Why not?
But I can read right?
You're denying yourself a true pleasure.
but like I might read a translated version. And if I didn't understand that, I might pick up the Cliff Notes so that I know what on earth is going on in War and Peace, right? Like there are many different levels at which we can engage with data, and we might need to find the appropriate one for us based on our work, on the decisions we have to make in our life, right? And sometimes we might have to step it up. If you get a complex medical diagnosis, you may have to invest some time in increasing your data literacy around the numbers that we use in medicine, right? Yeah. What does it mean if a test comes back that has a 98% chance, 98% specificity and a 90% sensitivity, and you get a positive result on that test, right? Like, what does that actually mean? And there's a level of data literacy, of comfort in interpreting those numbers that you're just going to have to develop. So that's for me what data literacy is some level of ability to accurately use the products of data.
One of the um, things that I see common that drive me insane out there when it comes to data literacy, and its usage is intentional to spur on people's fear, is when I'll hear a phrase like in the news, like there was a 25% increase to said such. And the first question you ask, what was the percentage in the first place? Yeah. And that's not it. They just and they intentionally hide that reality. They say, oh, there was a 2,000% increase into, well, maybe the percentage was 0.00001% in the first place, and they do it all the time. And I know they do it intentionally. It drives me insane.
Well, I mean, so I spent a lot of time talking about infectious diseases and studying it for my PhD. And I realized that the vast majority of the population has not done that when COVID happened. Right. And so all of a sudden, when people are talking about risks of infection and risks of serious disease, and I just realized how little exposure most of us truly have to informed discussions about risk. Like, what actually do these different numbers around risk mean? And how do we connect those numbers to the things that we want out of our lives? Right? How do we have truly intentional discussions and thoughts and decisions, right, around the things we want in our life? Sorry.
No, my dog wanted to make a comment, but I just said that I'll speak for her though, and I know what she wanted to say, and that was this: that I have this conversation so often with people, and a good example I always use, which is crazy, but for me, jumping out of an airplane is way more too risky for me to do. But again, statistically, it's probably not that big of a risk. And on top of that, those who enjoy it, they're willing to take whatever risk that is. So like you said, the value of risk is totally based upon your value system and how you think about and qualify your life and the things around you. And I try to have that conversation with people quite often. And people do have that tendency to think that there is a objective value to risk.
Exactly. And there is not. And this is where, like, I will never say, oh, well, you have to follow the numbers, follow the science. No, you don't. You make decisions about the things that matter to you. And those decisions can be quite complex because we don't make decisions in isolation, right? Your decision about how much risk of exposure to COVID and chance of catching that is not made in isolation of the impacts of how you avoid getting exposed to COVID, right? I mean, if you are at severe risk of suicide, locking yourself in your house may be that cost may not be worth the reduction that you get in your risk of COVID exposure. Yeah. And so we're not very good at being able to hold all the pieces that are involved in thinking about that just from a social sense, right? Like, just for me, thinking about all the things in my life that matter to me. And we're even worse at then considering the associated risks or costs or like data around than assessing all those things that are important to us.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about the whole COVID phenomenon in relation to data too, it's like you have and purpose in people and meaning in people's lives. You have, of course, this polarization that happened around COVID with these two extreme sides, and in a sense, both sides were overemphasizing this what they perceived as the science, right, to justify the narrative of how we should behave. When the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, as it always is.
Well, and I don't know that I would say overemphasizing the science. They were picking different numbers and then trying to use their numbers, like the thing that mattered to them the most, and trying to like beat the other side into saying like, why don't you agree with me? Because my number is clearly look at my number. That's the objectively most important number. And then the other side would be like, look at my number. It's the most objectively important number. And I think I see this happen a lot where we're actually having an argument about values. But we're trying to use data to disprove the other person's values. And you'll get absolutely nowhere with that.
And that's almost a definition of confirmation bias, right?
Not quite. So, I mean, with confirmation, and because for me, confirmation bias is where you seek out data that reaffirms a decision you've already made. right? In this case, you're trying to change somebody else's mind, but you're using the wrong language, right? You're using the wrong approach, because for me, like, so if we grossly oversimplify the argument around COVID lockdowns, one side was looking at like social values of freedom and self-determination, and the other side was looking at reduction in deaths from COVID.
Right.
Right? Like, what are our primary goals? Reduction in deaths from COVID, right? How do we keep those as small as possible? And how do we preserve self-determination and freedom? And so each side would sort of use numbers that would talk about why their approach, right, either lockdowns or not lockdowns, mask mandates, no mask mandates. And they would say, well, here are numbers that support why my side, why my choice will achieve the things that matter to me, right?
Right.
And so then they would say, oh, so like the side who was supporting lockdowns and mask mandates would say, well, we can save, millions of lives if we do this. And the other side was saying, but I will lose these enumerated freedoms. People will die from suicide in these ways because of lack of self-determination. And they would just yell those numbers at each other.
Right.
Rather than saying, well, hang on, I think the issue is that we're valuing different things as our top priority. And no amount of numbers is going to make you change your top priority. But if I say, hey, you know what? And this is actually the example that I like talking about is actually more vaccines. Like not COVID vaccines, kids vaccines, right? As a parent, I have to make a decision of whether to vaccinate my children. And when I watch people who believe you should vaccinate your kids against kids, parents who think they shouldn't, again, they tend to yell data at each other rather than look at the value, right? And what I found when I talk, I am a big proponent of vaccinating your children against common childhood diseases. And I was talking to a parent who was very concerned about this. And rather than immediately starting to pound them into submission with numbers that were my numbers, because this parent was quoting, numbers of times that she had heard that children had ended up being harmed by these childhood vaccinations. I said, you know what? I hear how concerned you are about keeping your kids safe. And you're worried about making the right choice that's going to give them the best chance to stay safe. And she's like, yeah, you're right. Like, yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. And I was like, then we both can have the same goal here.
That's right.
Now we have met on the same values. And so we can now have a discussion where our numbers are going to line up. Because now when I tell her, what's the risk of your kid getting measles and the damage that can come from measles versus what's the risk that they experience a serious side effect from vaccinations, right? And we can have a real discussion about that, because there are risks to getting your vaccination. There is no safe option here. And when we both recognize that we have the same goal, which is keeping our kids safe, and we're both willing to recognize the risks of both sides, now we can have this like very open and much more fruitful discussion than me just yelling at her saying, you must hate your kids. And she being like, I can't believe that you're just like falling victim to the corrupt, mega, what do they call the medical industrial complex, right? And you're just blindly doing what they say. Yeah, the pharmaceutical industrial complex. And then we would have gotten nowhere, right? Because we would have just yelled at each other with that.
Dan and I, we started this podcast to try to save the United States of America from utter crap from bad data. But that might have been a lofty goal, and we haven't gotten very far on that, and we're probably closer to collapse than we ever were. But we do want to try to help teams. And so this is interesting. And I'm wondering, can we focus and go, this happens in teams and organizations as well, right? I mean, teams the piece that I'm hooking onto right now, which the attempt to create direction from data. And I feel like you can, but I also feel like you can't. And it depends upon value systems and goals. I'm not a walking spreadsheet. So, so I'm a human being and I've got purposes. So let's talk about that space a little bit. Let's talk about how do we address this same problem where one is talking about what opposite ends of the same coin, and all I have to do is meet in the middle and start to discuss something at a particular vantage point, lens it so then they can actually move forward fruitfully. What does that look like? What are we talking about here?
Yeah. And I mean, honestly, with teams, it's the same approach, which is you have to start from a shared purpose and direction, right? Because again, that will never come from your data. You have to say, what are we trying to achieve as a team? What is our goal? And how does that goal fit potentially into the larger organizational goal? Right. So you're going to have a full organizational goal, maybe a set of goals, a mission, right? I work with mission driven organizations. So typically that mission's really clear, right? They're
Right.
there to make sure no child goes to bed hungry, or they're there to make sure that everyone has access to safe drinking water. Right? You have a very clear mission. And then each team within that organization will have an element of that mission that is theirs to support, whether it's to secure funding to get that, whether it's to actually operationalize, digging the wells, whatever that might be. There's going to be teams that have individual parts of that mission. And you need to be clear on what that is, because that is going to determine what data you need to help you make better decisions around that. But then also as a team, you have to decide what your team's values are, because we're going to walk in that door with all of our own values. And if that's not an explicit discussion of what the team's values are, people are just going to natively substitute their own values for the team's values. We do it without thinking. And then those values will impact how you weigh, to your point about jumping out of airplanes, right? How you weigh the results of your data.
Right.
And so you need to make sure, again, that that value conversation is explicit, right? Does your organization value sustainability, whether that's financial sustainability or environmental sustainability? Does your organization value diversity of thought, diversity of approach, right? Risk reduction, innovation? What are the values that drive your organization? Because oftentimes you'll have options that may both get you towards your goal, but may support one value much more than another value. And how do you decide which one to go? And my analogy that I always come back to is the idea of pulling out a smartphone with maps, right? That you have to have your destination. So you put your destination in, you're like, I'm going to my kid's school. And great, you told it where you wanted to go. You needed to provide that. And then Google or Apple Maps or whatever you're using is going to crunch so much data to be able to very accurately give you not one, not even two, usually 3 different routes that then support different values. One will be the fastest route. One will be the most eco-friendly route. One, which I love on Apple Maps, will give you the route with the fewest turns, right? Like the simplest route. And somebody just even told me that, yeah, exactly. And somebody even told me that there's now actually an app that you can get that will give you the route rated the highest for like improving mental well-being. So whether it's the prettiest or the least trafficky, or yeah, right? No amount of data will tell you which one of those you should take. All the data is required to tell you which route is each of those things. Like, good luck figuring out which route's the fastest when you don't have, the terabytes of data that Google has. You need that to give you the quantifications of those options. But then your values are going to help you decide it. And that's where I can see the teams breaking down if you haven't been explicit about what those values are, because you'll put the data on the table and you'll say, well, this route's clearly the fastest.
Yeah.
And so like clearly we should take that one. And everyone's like, what do you mean? This route's clearly the most eco-friendly. That's the route we should take.
This reminds me a lot. Oh, sorry. What you're describing reminds me a lot of strategic planning, right? Like we're getting everybody together and kind of focusing on getting the collective team together to articulate what the values are, so you can build that roadmap to where you want to go as far as your strategic plan.
But I think where strategic plans fail, though, is they never translate that into then definitions of data.
Okay.
Right? We support equity.
How can they do that?
Right. So like, let's say as a value, we support equity. Okay, how are you going to measure which of your decisions is going to promote equity the most? How are you knowing that, right? Like the reason that the Google Maps or Apple Maps works is they have a definition for what's the most eco-friendly route, right? Which route uses the least gas? They have a definition for which route's the fastest, the one that takes you the least time. They have a definition for which one has the fewest turns because they're counting up the turns and telling you that, right? And they have all the data to be able to turn that out. And where I see like the process breaks down on either end, that you might do the strategic plan and have all these grand values and have said where we're going, and you never say how you're going to know if you're getting there, right? You've never set your compass points. You haven't set the measures for saying, are we achieving those values or not? And then you're not collecting the data to then fulfill those measures. Or you collect all this data And then, like I said, your argument breaks down because you're throwing different numbers at each other, and you have no way of making up the fact that, or of realigning the fact, right, that you might be valuing the numbers coming in differently.
Yeah, I work in higher ed, as you do too, right? You teach, you're a professor. Um, and I'm thinking about higher ed strategic planning, and then in the age of COVID, right? And one thing that keeps coming to mind that speaks to what you just shared about your criticisms of strategic planning, which I agree with, that often we come up with these plans, they end up on a shelf collecting dust. We're not really collecting data. And I think that's been, and setting benchmarks and measuring, are we making any progress toward the goals that we have articulated. And I think another complication with that in our current age is the rapidity of change in our environments, right? Like over the past, I want to say 4 or 5 years, because it kind of predate the rapid changes that we've been experiencing predate COVID, and they're accelerating. And when that happens, all the data keeps changing, so your benchmarks keep having to change. You know, and so I'm going to give a very concrete example. So we're talking about equity. So if we look at the data that we had from 4 years ago around how, let's say, Black males were doing in college, that's going to be very different than how they're doing today, right? Which is abysmal. It's abysmal, right? And it's not just that group of students either. It is all students are plummeting, especially freshmen and sophomore students coming into higher education. Their performance rates are tanking because of the consequences of keeping them at home during COVID, right? I hope people don't think this is not a political podcast. It is. We try to be above that, so we're not making a partisan statement with this. But that's what the data kind of shows.
No, there's very strong research that is pointing out serious academic delays at all grades. I mean, the UK has done some extraordinary research in looking at how far behind kids have fallen because of, from an academic point of view. And again, this is where, and I love that you pointed out of, oh, we're not making this political. There is nothing political about that statement, right? It is just the data show that test scores and preparedness in different academic subjects are significantly worse now, right? And I don't know the percentage. The even less political way of saying it would be to just say are 25%. I think in the UK they've showed that it's 1 to 2 grades behind, right? So their test scores and their preparedness in different academic subjects are 1 to 2 test grades behind. There's nothing political about that. But the problem is that people will hear that, and depending which side they sit on, and this is where confirmation bias comes in, is they'll say, see, I told you lockdowns were a bad idea. You agree with me, right? Or
right.
The other person will say, oh, you're putting that out. Like, I can't believe that you would rather have had like 10 million people die instead of having, kids struggle a little bit in school. Well, we didn't say either of those statements. All we stated was a fact, but we are so quick to put an interpretation on that fact that we seamlessly do it without realizing that we've even put the interpretation on, right?
Yeah, I think there's nothing wrong, on the surface with the lockdowns per se, right? But we can't ignore the consequences of that. Otherwise, we're being negligent, because now we've got to fix that situation. We have to provide the girders and the supports for those students who are behind so that they can catch up and be successful. If we deny that's happening, then we're in a lot of trouble. Because that decline in performance is going to perpetuate itself throughout those people's lives and throughout society.
Doesn't Emperor's No Clothes has a common thread through? I mean, that's a common trope, right? And going back to sort of a team and organization kind of conversation. I mean, there's so many situations where you put yourself in danger, maybe, if you approach leadership with data that suggests something that they were hoping was the opposite or was not what they were wanting to hear. And again, there's inferences. You can actually have data that doesn't even imply what they think it's going to imply, but it's going to imply something else. How do you negotiate that space? What are some tactics to kind of start that conversation without having to get that knee-jerk reaction against?
So I have two main tactics I use. The first is wherever possible, predetermining benchmarks, right? So I work with nonprofits. And so let's say you have a program where you're doing an after school reading program and you're hoping that that will help offset some of these losses in ability to, at reading levels from delays in school. Before you put the program in place, I would say, what gains do we have to see for us to continue this program next year? We're going to define that right now. We're going to say we need to see these gains in these areas. We need to see them with less than a, 5 percentage point difference among races or genders, or, if you have an equity lens, right? Like, you'd put all those boundaries in before you measure the program. Because if you do that, then when you walk in with the benchmarks, it's not an argument about, well, is that a good enough thing? Right? To your point of, people will have this inferences already ready. If they want the program to continue, they're going to accept whatever number you come in with, right? If they think the program's a waste of money, they're going to say whatever number you come with isn't going to be good enough. But by setting it before the numbers come in, you've already all agreed on it. And then when the numbers come in, now it's just a choice of, okay, we met that benchmark. We're good to go. Everyone agreed. We already had this argument, right? We already said it before it was loaded with the data already being there. The second one I use is I call the devil's analyst, which is, again, if somebody comes in with this heavy position that they are really deeply invested in, I say, what data would change your mind? Before I bring them any data, what data would change your mind?
Right.
And if they can't come up with any data that would actually change their mind, then we can say, all right, this isn't going to be a data-driven discussion that we're going to have, right? You've got a dogmatic position that you're going to stick with, and that might be fine, right? And on you go with your life or whatever. But also it may bring them to the point of like, wow, I really am like very bought into this position and I'm not comfortable changing it. And I've got some work to do about how to change that. Or if they give you the data, right? Well, I would sunset this program if I found out that it costs 3 times more than any other program. All right, well, now I can go find that. And if it doesn't cost 3 times more, then we'll keep doing the program because that's what you told me you needed to see. But if I come back and it does cost 3 times more, well, you've already told me that that's what you needed to see, and here you go, right? And again, by having that discussion before you bring the data there, it kind of nips the whole confirmation bias in the bud because you've already set the benchmark, or they've told you. You're not forcing it on them. They've told you what needs to come to them for them to have a different opinion or to have this opinion versus that opinion.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So I work in, again, like higher ed, and I lead some teams. And, one thing I want to do is help them improve on being a better with data. How can we use data to move us forward once we've gone through a planning process and identified our goals and taken out the confirmation biases we've just discussed and really set, some value-based goals on the horizon for us? How can I make sure that my team is trained up and thinking adequately about data to collect it and analyze it to make sure that we're assessing as we go and making incremental changes to move us forward?
I mean, I think the first thing is to identify the roles that your team's going to take on around data. Because not all of them will be doing the analysis. Not all of them will be doing the data collection, right? Not all of them may be reading every level of report or analysis or data product that comes out. And so you want to define those roles clearly for each team member, and where possible, allow team members to opt into those roles, right? Like, we don't always love being voluntold, right? With what level we need to be doing things. And then once you have a role, that will impact, right, what each role needs to be prepared, right? If you are a data collector, you're going to need to have some knowledge about data governance. You're going to need to have knowledge about standards of data collection, right? You're going to need to have knowledge about the meanings of the things that you're collecting and how to make sure that you're upholding the integrity of the data. But if I'm not collecting data, I don't really need any of that. If instead I'm the analyst, right, I'm going to need a lot more technical skills. I'm going to need software skills. I'm going to need some really good domain expertise to make sure that I'm not doing silly things with the data that are coming into me, right? That I'm understanding from a business side or an operations side what the data elements mean and how I can use them and how I can't. I'm going to need good stats backgrounds, right? Like, there's that technical stuff that I'm going to need as an analyst. If I'm a report user, right, I'm going to use the products of the data to help my decisions. Well, now I need to make sure that I understand things like the difference between relative and absolute risk, right? We were just talking about that earlier, right? That's going to be
Right.
something I need to understand. Basic probabilities, understanding what we mean when we say there's a 20% chance of something happening. Like, what does that really mean? Understanding proxy measures, I think, is one of a big area of data literacy that we're missing, of helping people understand what are we actually reporting on. When you see this number, what does that actually mean? And then
Right.
how can we use that to potentially estimate the thing we really cared about? Because most of the time we can't actually measure the things we really care about, but we can get close. And so if you don't have that concept of what proxy measures even are, and you don't have the detail about your particular proxy measures of what you're actually measuring and how you're going to use it in your decisions, you can make choices that maybe aren't what you want. So those would be what I would say of like helping your teams be more prepared. There's not one answer because it's going to be influenced by the rules that they're taking with the data.
Dan, I want to ask you a question on that one too, and I mean both of you. But how important is it to have you didn't suggest everybody, you just said your team, but who needs? How do I ask this question? I personally think from a self-fulfillment purpose, just living life as a human being, everybody should care about this stuff, right? It's part of communication. It's part of modern day communication. But from a functional perspective, as a worker, Dan, and in general, does everybody need to be fluent in this language? Can people get by and just do their job without having to be fluent in this language, or is the world beyond that now?
No, I don't think everyone has to be fluent in the language. I think it's helpful if they are at some level that where it intersects with their work, and it doesn't always intersect with everybody's work. But I think if you want to have an egalitarian environment where everyone is able to provide input on the direction that we're going in, and help assess and make sure we're staying on the map that we have laid out for us, ourselves, I think it's helpful for them to be able to provide informed feedback if they participate at some level. And I think, yeah, to Alexandra's point, I think not everyone's going to want to be involved in data collections. Not everyone likes statistics. Not everyone likes dealing with that type of things. But hopefully there are people on your team who do like that kind of stuff,
Right.
and they volunteer to do that kind of work because they enjoy it, and then they can help explain it to what their findings are to the rest of the team. So I don't think everybody has to be involved, but I think we're talking about teams, and so I think that's where I'm coming from. Like, how do I get the team situated so that we are all prepared to tackle data as part of our day-to-day and long-term planning process.
How do you create a data-rich environment that people who want to know about it can leverage it and use it? Makes sense. And I guess I was just kind of thinking sort of, if I'm a baseball player, baseball is a statistical game through and through. Those who know it, the coaches, if you guys ever read Moneyball, Alexandra, I'm assuming you might have read that. I'm sure there's probably flaws in it that you could point out too, I bet. That's a statistical, but it was also one based off of guesses, hunches. It's as statistical as it is the opposite almost, right? But if I'm a great pinch hitter and I go out there and I hit that ball, I can be the best at that and not even have to give a damn about that statistics, right? I'm just good at my game. I'm just solid, So I was just kind of coming from that vantage point,
Well, I want to say one other thing in response to your question too. I think direction data helps with making sure that we're finding a direction and we're moving toward a specific direction.
Yes.
I think in our particular environment, and I'm again speaking it from higher ed, we've been through this storm of COVID-19 and everything like that. And I feel like a lot of organizations feel what we call rudderless, like we don't know what direction we're going in. And so having a conversation around data helps us kind of articulate, okay, where do we want to go and how do we know that we're getting to where we want to go?
And I would push back a little, Jodah, on this. So you say I'm a
Okay.
great pinch hitter, right? I don't have to know anything about data to just go out and, hit a good hit.
Yeah.
Well, let's say you want to get a little better. And so you sit down with your coach and your coach says, I think you're missing the sliders. How would you know if you were? Right? The best way would be to go back and review all your hits and all your strikeouts and use a little bit of data to say, you know what? Yeah, you're twice as likely to strike out when the last pitch is a slider than when it's something else. And so you don't have to use a ton of data, but I would argue that if you want to get better at something, one of the best things you can use is a few breadcrumbs of data to kind of give you a little bit more of a boost of the chance of your intervention making you that much better.
Fascinating.
No, I love that analogy. I love that.
In fact, Dan and I just had a conversation around know thyself with some other people, and it sounds like you're saying being sort of statistical, data savvy is a good tool to know thyself.
Exactly. And again, it doesn't have to be an outrageous level of data, right? I mean, that data point I just told you, you could do on a piece of paper. Your coach could sit there and just do tallies, right? How many times does he strike out when the last pitch is a slider versus how many times does he strike out when it's a fastball? And you just do little tick marks on a piece of paper and you count them up and it's some simple division, right? But the idea is that you have to identify what is it that you're going to need to help you make those decisions, right? And then you're going to figure out exactly how far into the data world you need to go. But there's always a little bit of data that could help you. I don't think any of us could say that we wouldn't benefit from a base level of comfort with numbers. I mean, go to the grocery store and try to decide if you're going to buy the apples that are 3 for $5 or the ones that are 99 cents a pound.
True.
Right?
Yeah.
Basic number literacy to make that decision at the grocery store.
Yeah. I solved that by not buying apples. I can't stand it.
Well, also understanding how data works, which I think can bring us to the third section of this conversation, which is about artificial intelligence, which is really data-driven, a data-driven language model. How do you see artificial intelligence impacting how we collect and analyze data in the present and moving forward into the future?
Well, and this is one more reason why I think a base level of data literacy for everybody is going to be essential, because AI is going to be baked into so much of what we do. And if the vast majority of us don't have any level of understanding of how those algorithms work, how they're influenced by the data that are being fed into them, that they're being trained on, right? We're going to have a whole lot of stuff done to us that we don't stand up and say, that's not how we want it done, or we want it done this way versus that way, right? And you can only have those conversations. You can only have that level of intelligent engagement or intentional, I don't mean intelligent, intentional engagement, if you have a basic understanding of that. You don't have to know how AI models actually work mathematically, right? But you do need to understand a little bit of how the data that comes into them is impacting it and what it means
you have
when
to
an AI
understand
model
that they are
predicts
mathematically based.
Yes,
right? Because
exactly.
the interface gives the illusion that you are being spoken to with language, but behind that language are a bunch of statistics.
And I think the number one thing that we need to understand about how AI works is that it is 100% past based. Meaning, whatever it's telling you about now, whatever it's telling you about the future, it's basing that off of what it's seen in the past.
Right.
And we already know, and there are so many more qualified people out there to talk to about this, but I will just bring up, right, that if, for example, you train an AI model on tell me who the best people are to hire for engineers, and you feed it 20 years worth of hiring data and the results of how many people stick around in your company and who ends up being very successful as an engineer, blah, 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 your model, and they've already done this, your model comes back and says you should hire a man. Because historically, that's what we've done. No, it's just that historically, that's what we've done. And so your AI model is looking at what's been done, and it's saying, well, 90% of the engineers that stay in your company for 10 years are men. So if I want to give you a 90% chance that they stay with your company, I'm going to say hire a man. And it's not that the AI model itself is sexist, right? It's not like, I hate women, right? It's just basing its future predictions off of what it's seen happen in the past. And that's, again, where when you said, how is it going to impact our data collection? It depends on how committed we are to making sure that our models that we develop going forward are taking us the place that we intend them to take, or whether we're going to just sort of passively accept whatever comes out of them. And if we decide to take a stand and say, we want to make sure that we're steering the ship the way we want to go, we're not just going to follow the numbers, but we're going to go the direction we want to go, then we are going to have to change how we're collecting data. We're going to have to change how we're processing it when we put it into models. There's going to have to be new oversampling techniques that come in, right, to correct for the way that things have been happening in the past of the history before, the way that we have the data already. And we may have to come up with new statistical models. I mean, there's a lot of things that we might have to do differently. But again, only if we're willing to actually engage with them intentionally.
Do you see yourself using AI, and how do you see yourself using AI? And AI is loaded, right? Because there's a lot of this guy right here is what a lot of people think of AI. We already have AI for the past 20 years to some degree with heuristic analysis, automated. So anyways, but how would you?
Yeah, and like you have the whole very vague umbrella of machine learning and artificial intelligence and so many different kinds of artificial intelligence, right? Natural language processing is very different than algorithmic predictions.
That's right.
Right. So like
that's right.
We're being like fast and sloppy with sort of that general categorization. But yes, I think using tools, it goes back to the like, I'm not going to use a sword because it can kill people. Well, I also can use it to cut steak, right? Like knives are useful, but they can be really bad. It's not the tool itself that necessarily means that it's good or bad. We can be very thoughtful in how we engineer it and in picking the right tools. Like I probably don't need a katana to cut my steak. A nice steak knife would
Although
work
it would
really
be
well.
fun.
It'd be really fun, but exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. All again goes towards what's your goal?
John Belushi pictures going on in my head. Samurai
Right?
chef, yes.
Right?
I think we got a clip we got to add.
And so when you say, am I going to use AI? Well, yes, if I find a really good tool and I've done my research in terms of how it's going to support me, I'm going to find ways that I can use it that helps me be better at what I do. But I'm not going to just blindly say, well, AI, you decide things. I mean, so ChatGPT is a great example because that's what everyone's using. I find it really helpful when I'm doing presentations and I need a very specific story or example.
Yeah.
And I can say, hey, ChatGPT, I want you to find me an example in 1800s history, right? That era of how we used to do medicine in a way that was actually harmful instead of helpful. The things that we used to think were actually hurtful, and we practice this in medicine, and we now know that that's different. And it'll give me 6 examples. And then I can go and verify that those are real. I'll say, give me your sources. I'll go look up the sources, right? And that's a great way to use ChatGPT because it's helping basically organize the information out there. And I know what example I wanted. I've written the talk, right? And I'm looking for a very specific example, and it can find it for me.
Yeah, it's a research assistant in many ways. I mean, I could see also from qualitative research, I could see having it help with transcripts, even doing some coding for you, so you can find themes and stuff like that. I could really see it expediting somebody's dissertation process.
Yeah. And again, allowing, like, I've always been a huge proponent of let machines do what machines are good at so that humans can do what humans are good at. And I think the most effective way of using AI will be exactly that, of like, let's not have AI do the things that really are what we are good at, because it's going to do it wrong, or there's going to be some serious unintended consequences of that. But if we have it do things that we're not that great at, right? And then it frees us up to focus on the things that we do better, then that's a wonderful partnership. I mean, I think about medical coding, right? Rather than having your doctor spend half the time he or she has with you trying to figure out how to chart things, have a speech recognition software listen to what the doctor's saying and translate all of that into the codes so that he can sit there and just talk to you, right? Or she can just say, hey, tell me about your medical history. And she's sitting there looking at you in the eyes while you're telling her about what's happened to you medically. And that's just transcribing in the background. And the doctor doesn't have to worry about that, right?
Yeah. And there's somebody double checking. There's still
yes, 100%.
The doctor still have to double check that for sure.
100%. And that's true of a lot of things, right? A lot of things of what we do. In fact, even with human coders, there are mistakes that get made. So I would say that, and this brings back, we talk about self-driving cars, and people are like, well, what if it crashes? I'm like, we kill 60,000 people every year when we crash, right? Like, we don't need self-driving cars to be have zero accidents. We just need them to be better than we are.
Yeah, for sure.
Right.
For sure. And I really appreciate what you're saying about focusing on what humans are good at, which is, again, to your example of looking the patient in the eye, that empathy aspect,
Yeah.
and I think humans have taste too. To go back to the jokes that we used at the beginning of this episode, they're terrible jokes, right? We said them anyhow, but we can assess that they're not very good jokes. But AI doesn't know that. AI thinks they're brilliant.
But Dan, I could write a bad joke too. Trust me, all my jokes will be bad if I write them. Does that make me AI? Or maybe it
You
does.
could write a bad joke, but you'd know it's a bad joke. AI doesn't know it's a bad joke.
I don't know if I would or wouldn't. Maybe, yeah. I'd hope I would, for sure.
Yeah.
All right. Well, here's a really, on this topic, super important question, Alexandra. With all the analysis and the data collection you've done on AI, will AI take over the world and destroy us, humanity as we know it? What are the statistics?
Right. Pretty sure I've seen that Terminator movie. Actually, all three of those Terminator movies, or whatever. It's like 6 now. I think that's up to us. So I think a better question is, are we going to put AI in a position where it does things to us that we claimed we didn't want it to do? Right. I think the odds of a true Skynet that becomes self-aware and it makes decisions to take over. And I would even argue, as cheesy as Skynet is, that there were decisions humans made earlier on that enabled that, right? This, and I come back to, I had to read 1984 and Brave New World in high school. And I remember thinking about how we're all so worried about Big Brother. We're all so worried about the 1984 where some foreign agent, right? This outside they comes in and takes us over. And really, Brave New World was so much more accurate that we do it to ourselves, right? That in Brave New World, it's not that there's any external bad guy. It's that we all wanted easier, softer, cushier lives. We didn't want to work so hard, and we were willing to give things up and turn over authority of things in our own lives to ourselves, right? To our machines, to the things that we create for ourselves. No one does it to us. We do it to ourselves.
That's a theme
and I think
Dan and I have
true.
talked about. Yeah, Dan and I have had this discussion around this notion. Yeah. Sorry, Dan. Go ahead, Dan.
No. I was just going to agree. No, I think it's true. The horror of the 1984 style surveillance state is that we have done it to ourselves, right? Through social media, through having cameras everywhere, through the way we think about the world. I mean, yeah, we're doing it to ourselves.
Yeah, and an example I've used with previously with Dan was like just as simple as the phone of Google Maps. Google Maps will tell me to get from point A to point B, and that's simple. I assume, on one hand, sometimes that it probably knows better about how to get me from point A to point B because I assume it knows stuff that I don't know from a modeling perspective. Perhaps there's an accent, things like that. But there have been instances where I've decided to go. I know there's a faster way, and I got there faster. It did not know about that alley. It did not know, but I have a tendency to say, to your point with the Brave New World concept, it's easier to not make a decision. That any level of decision is actually a point of friction in the brain potentially. It actually will make your stress levels go up a little bit. It could be good stress, it could be good bad stress. Just, should I pick up that cup of coffee? That's a decision-making mechanism. And will we get to the point where we'll be like, you know what? I'm just not going to make decisions anymore. This machine's going to make them all for me, and to your, so definitely a cautionary tale.
Yeah,
exactly.
So I'm going to start closing this up, Alexandra. What is the big takeaway from this episode? Now that we've been talking about data and data teams and data literacy for the last hour, what are some of the big takeaways that you think the audience should think about as they go off into podcast land?
I guess I would start with a challenge, which is everyone should come up with something they could do that would make them either more comfortable around data products or more effective with data products. So every single one of us could identify something we could do, whether that's, like I said, learning a little bit more about relative versus absolute risk, right? Probabilities. And next level up, like I would challenge doctors to learn about Bayesian statistics because it would help them interpret their medical tests a whole lot better. So that would be my first, is just, can you do that sort of know thyself moment and say, what could I do that would make me just that much better, more comfortable, even if right now I identify as a non-data person? Because again, I'll tell you, you're not. Everyone's a data person. We all have to be. And the second I would say is Right? How you can approach these conversations with the humility of saying, we all have values. We may have different values. That doesn't make you wrong to have a different value than I have.
Mm.
And when we can get to that point where we can respect each other as humans, equal humans with the right to live on the planet, that then we can lean into the data around us to help us get to better places. And it has to be both. We're not going to get there just by
Right.
wishing it. We're not going to get there when we all hold hands and sing kumbaya. That'll be a great first step, but that can't be
Right.
the only step. Just like we talked about with strategic planning, it can't stop. It has to start. It has to start with the values and the mission, but it can't stop there. It has to continue on to then how we measure, how we know that we're on track, how we have our compasses to guide us.
Nice. So, Alexandra, how do people find you if they want to enlist your services to get some consultation or education around data and analytics? How do they reach out to you?
So, to the best of my knowledge, I'm the only Alexandra Mannerings on LinkedIn. So you can find me there. My company, Mirakinos, is at mirakinos.com. So you can find me there. And then I also have my own podcast. So if you want to hear data specific conversations, so not nearly as broad and far reaching as what you do, but we have conversations about data in nonprofits. And that's called Heart, Soul, and Data.
Oh, nice. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. It's been a pleasure having you. We'd love to have you back again. And
definitely.
This was really informative.
Bring you on, have a conversation with a couple other people, maybe talk about data. If you would, this has been a great conversation. Thanks, Alexandra.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you for having me today.
Thanks, everybody.
Cheers. Bye. And recording.